Hi everyone, this is a new video on Oxygen Not Included, and today we'll see how to produce oxygen. So depending on how far you are in the game, you will have access to different technologies and therefore different ways to produce oxygen, but we'll start with the most basic one. The most basic one is Oxylite, so you don't need to do anything. Basically you should have some of it on your map, and it will evaporate and create oxygen by itself. So here we are in a vacuum area, in a vacuum room, and this oxylite should evaporate some oxygen. We can see that we have a vacuum area here in this room, so that means that there is no gas, and we have 200 grams of oxylite. So when we start the game, it slowly evaporates and spread over the room. So now we have a little bit less mass of oxylite, and it's going to slowly evaporate in the room. I sped up the game so all the oxylites could be released, and then I pumped all the oxygen that was in this room in order to put it in this gas reservoir. The oxylite cell was about 200 kilograms, and in the gas reservoir we have only about 100 kilograms, which is half of what the cell mass was. And that's because oxylite cells only evaporates half of the mass. So half of 200 kilograms is 100 kilograms. A question was wondering is what would happen if that oxylite were to be dug. So here we have 200 kilograms of oxylite that I'm going to dig. It is in a lot of oxygen already, so it's about 200 kilograms of oxygen, so it will prevent this oxylite to evaporate. So I'm going to dig that tile. So it was about 200 kilograms, and now we can see that it's only 100 kilograms after it's been dug, which is half of its mass. So we'll see how much oxygen it generates. To do that, I'm just going to remove this oxygen here and pump all the oxygen that it generates. So now we have a vacuum room where this oxylite can evaporate. So I sped up the process and I let all the oxylite generate the oxygen. So now it's fully evaporated, and I pumped all that oxygen in that gas reservoir, and we can see that there's about 100 kilograms in that gas reservoir of oxygen. So even if the oxylite that was dug was only half of the mass of the cell oxylite, it produced as much oxygen, which means that you will not lose any resources by digging up oxylite. Now that we've seen how to use oxylite to generate oxygen, we will see a more reliable way to produce oxygen, because the main problem of oxylite is that you don't control how much you have on the map, and you don't control where to evaporate that oxygen. So we will see how we can have more control over that. The simplest technology to generate oxygen is probably the oxygen diffuser. So this oxygen diffuser will require some algae that a duplicant will need to put into it, to deposit into that diffuser, and it will generate oxygen around it. Unfortunately, that diffuser will produce some heat. So here we can see it's 1.5 kilodtus per second, which means that over time it's going to get warmer and warmer around it, and it will make your base warmer. Eventually you will need to deal with that heat, because your duplicants are not gonna be happy with it, or your plants will not be able to grow anymore, and you will need to cool down your base. So now we're gonna see how it works. So I just set up 2 oxygen diffusers, and they need to be connected to power. So I just used ZF2 power in this case, but it can be any source of power, and it's going to require 100 watt in order to function each. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to create a duplicant so it can put algae in these 2 diffusers, and these 2 diffusers can generate oxygen. I'm going to also vacuum this room so we can see that it produces oxygen. So So the two oxygen diffusers have just started to work in the vacuum area, in the vacuum room. So now we're going to see that it generates oxygen that quickly spread over the room. These diffusers consumes 550 grams of algae per second and only emits 500 grams of oxygen, which means that they produce 50 grams less of oxygen than they consume algae. Now we're going to see the next way to produce oxygen, and to do that we will use the electrolyzer. This is probably the most common way to produce oxygen. It's going to take in water and it will convert this water into oxygen and hydrogen. So for 1 kilogram of water, it will convert it into 888 gram of oxygen and 112 gram of hydrogen. So I'll quickly go through the setup. Here I have a dev pump liquid in order to provide water to the two electrolyzers, and these electrolyzers also need power in order to function. They need 120 watts per second. So in order to do that, I use the dev generator. And now we will see how this works. I've activated the gas overlay and I've emptied the room with all the gas that it contained. So now we can see how these two electrolyzers work. So I'm going to unpause the game, and we can see that it quickly produce oxygen and hydrogen, and we can see that the hydrogen tends to go up and the oxygen tends to go down. And the reason is because the hydrogen is lighter than the oxygen, so naturally it goes up because it's lighter, and the oxygen goes down because it's heavier. So I'm going to let it time to stabilize. So the gases have time to stabilize, and we can see that here the two electrolyzers are not producing gases anymore. That's because the room has reached its max pressure, so there's too much pressure, there's too much gas pressure in the room for the two electrolyzers to produce gases. And we can see that the hydrogen is at the top of the room and the oxygen at the bottom of the room. So it's not half of the top half is not hydrogen and the bottom half is not oxygen. That's because there is more oxygen than hydrogen. That's due to the production that we've seen earlier. But with that information, we can place gas pump on the top of the room in order to get the hydrogen, and gas pump on the bottom of the room to get oxygen. There are specific designs that make it more efficient. I'm not going to go through them in this video. So one important detail to note about these electrolyzers is that they produce heat. So they don't produce as much heat as the oxygen diffuser that we've seen earlier. It was producing 1.5 kDTU per second, the oxygen diffuser, where the electrolyzer is only producing 1.25 kDTU per second. This is not much, but over time the room is going to get hotter and hotter, and if you put that that oxygen back into your colony, into your main base, your duplicant might start complaining because it's too warm, and then your plant might stop growing because it's too warm as well, and they're not in the comfort temperature. So eventually you're going to run into issues because of that. So one way to solve that problem is to find one of these machines, anti-entropy thermal nullifier. You need to provide them with hydrogen via that insulated gas pipe. I didn't do it here, but you will need to do it if you want it to provide constant cooling. So that's not proper cooling, but that will cool down the area around it. So once you find this machine, you can set up pipes in a certain way so it can cool down the oxygen before you send it to your colony. So here, what I did, I just took the gas from, in that case the oxygen from the room where we produce the oxygen, and we can see that it's about 31 degrees when it leaves the room, and when it comes here it's already a bit cooler, it's about 22 degrees, and once it goes through the radiant pipe it goes even way lower. When it leaves around minus 12 degrees, here it's 17, it can vary a little bit, so you probably wouldn't want to cool down your oxygen that much, but this is how you can control the temperature of the oxygen and therefore the temperature that is going to be in your base. So the more radiant pipes you have, the more heat is going to be transferred. So radiant pipe are for a very high transfer of heat. So the less radiant pipe you have, the less heat you'll transfer, and the more you have, the more heat you will transfer. The last machine that we're going to see that produces oxygen is the rust deoxidizer. So this machine takes in rust and salt, so you need to have access to these resources in order to make it work. And it will produce quite different things. So it's going to produce oxygen, mostly chlorine, and also iron ore. So in total it's going to take 1 kilogram, so 750 grams of rust and 250 grams of salt, and it's going to produce 570 grams of oxygen, 30 grams of chlorine, and 400 grams of iron ore. So it doesn't produce a lot of oxygen, it's a little bit less than 60% of the resources it consumes, but it transforms all its mass, because in total here we have 1 kilogram, and in the input is 1 kilogram. So 1 kilogram in the input for 1 kilogram in the output, and it's going to produce a bit of heat as well. So we're going to face the same problem as we mentioned before. We will need to cool that oxygen if we want to put it back in our base, if we don't have to run into trouble. Now I'll run into the setup very quickly. So I have 2 of the rust deoxidizer. They both consume 60 watts, so that's pretty low. And I have an auto sweeper in order to move the resources either in or out of these rust oxidizers. The iron should be put in that middle storage bin here, and all the machines are powered by this DEV generator. So now I'm going to vacuum this room, so there will be no oxygen, no gases at all, and we'll see what happens. I vacuumed the room, so there's no gases inside that room, and now I'm going to unpause the game and see what happens. So we can see that the auto sweeper is delivering resources to the two machines, and it's bringing back some iron ore that was already produced. This rust deoxidizer has just kicked in, and that one as well, and it's starting to produce oxygen and chlorine. So one more time, the oxygen and the chlorine will need to stabilize. So the chlorine should go down and the oxygen should go up, because the chlorine is heavier than the oxygen. So that way we can pump these resources by putting a gas pump on the top of the room and one on the bottom of the room in order to get the chlorine and the oxygen. So now I'll give it a bit of time to stabilize. The 2 rust deoxidizer has stopped working because now the room is overpressured, and we can see that the chlorine is on the bottom of the room and the oxygen is on the top of the room. So at the bottom is mixed up because there are only 30 grams of chlorine for 570 grams of oxygen. So that's why we have much less chlorine than oxygen, but the chlorine tends to go down and the oxygen tends to go up. We can also see that there's some iron in that storage bin. So these 2 rust deoxidizers have produced iron that the auto sweeper stored in that storage bin.